an unexpected spiritual journey to becoming a pastor with a doctorate degree in ministry, followed by a spiritual restlessness leading to an equally unexpected path to serve a broader community as the director of Heartland HOUSED, an organization devoted to achieving functional zero homelessness in Springfield, Illinois. This is the story of Josh Sabo's journey of faith and service. This is God Unites, finding spiritual harmony as we explore common interests. Welcome, I'm David Risley. Our guest today is Josh Sabo, and Josh is the Executive Director of Heartland HOUSED. And Josh, I want to thank you for being a guest on this program today.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm excited to be a part of this.
Now, some people may wonder why on a faith-oriented podcast like God Unites, we have a conversation with you, who are the executive director of an organization that coordinates and, to some extent, delivers services and shelter for the homeless. Well, there's two reasons for that. One, you used to be a pastor.
That's true.
And I'd like to talk about your faith journey to becoming a pastor, and then your journey from becoming pastor to your current position working with homelessness. But the second thing is when we talk about these matters of the Spirit that unite people across faith boundaries, helping the people who are helpless, right, including the homeless, I think is a fundamental value of all faiths. And so it's a common interest. And that's the whole idea of God Unites, to bring people together to speak a common faith language or spiritual language.
I love it.
So
sounds great.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about first your faith journey from that led you to become a pastor. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about from pastor to Heartland HOUSED. And then let's talk about homelessness, the situation in Springfield, the strategy for dealing with it. So first, tell us the story of what led you to become a pastor. Is that something that you always thought of doing or planned of doing? Tell us about it.
I never would have imagined that's a position I would have been in. So I grew up in the church. My mom was a Sunday school teacher. And so, my earliest memories, church was always a part of our life. And so when I was in youth group, I had some great experiences with mentors and, youth pastors at my church growing up that were really formative for me. I think I had three brothers. I had a great, support within my family. But the mentorship I got through that youth ministry, and in particular, Austin was the youth minister for most of my high school years. That really helped guide me through that time of my life. And so when I got to college, I was like your typical, I have no idea what I'm going to pursue. It was like general business, and then it was nonprofit management. And after my second year of college, I got the opportunity to serve as a summer youth ministry intern at a church here in Springfield. And so I should say I grew up outside of Atlanta, Georgia. So all of those years, and then I went to college at Georgia State University there in Atlanta. And so the opportunity to come to Illinois for the summer was like a nice way to not work construction over the summer. And so it was just an interesting thing to explore. And so in that process, I got to work with, kind of another person who became a mentor for me, the youth minister at the church at that time, and just had a great time. We spent the summer playing. It was really about building relationship with youth, right? So it was playing ping pong and doing those types of things. And so I loved it. So the next year I came up for another summer internship, and then the next year I did it again. And then the church had some transition and said, hey, would you consider, maybe a year-long internship? And so that was where it got difficult to say, okay, what am I pursuing? Those experiences doing summer internships, they led me to change my college major to middle grades education. So I was on my way to become a middle school teacher at that point. And so, after thinking about that, I was like, well, I'm interested in exploring this more. It's been a great experience. And so at that point I moved to Springfield. It was in late 2004. And I did that until I finished my degree at UIS. And that was the point where it was like, okay, what am I going to do now? Am I going to teach or pursue ministry? And so I applied to a seminary outside of Chicago and got a full scholarship. And
where was that?
Northern Seminary. It was located in Lombard at the time, but historically connected to American Baptist churches, but really serves a really diverse group of students. So with that full scholarship, it felt like, there's I should explore this deeper. And so I went back and forth between Springfield and Lombard, and in 3 years, got my master's in divinity. At that time, still doing youth ministry and, at the church. And then at that time, there was more transition at the church. And in 2009, they hired me to be the youth pastor. So it really was, that experience, it just all sort of happened pretty organically, really. Like it felt like, where I was, like this is something that's meaningful for me, and it's a way for me to do something I'm passionate about. And, that idea from my experience in youth ministry, having people walk with me and guide me, to have the opportunity to do that with other students was something that I just love doing. And so it all just sort of fell into place. I never really had a moment where I was like, yeah, this is absolutely, I'm going to work in a church and I'm going to do ministry. But as the pieces came together, it made sense at the time for each step.
Let me explore that. Just let's go into a little deeper level.
Sure.
When you talk about someone walking beside you and guiding you when you were the youth, being ministered to,
right.
What is it that guided to what?
Yeah, I think I think all of us for those teenage years they're tricky years, right? So, part of that was just life guidance, right? Like, making decent decisions, but then also just through, the activities of the church and, just learning more about who Jesus was and what that meant for my life and really getting to, I think perhaps most impactful for me, seeing the way that my youth minister embodied that and lived that out, it felt really authentic and true. And so it helped me to explore those questions myself at that time of my life and really kind of grab onto something in terms of my faith that, maybe prior to that was just, I'm at church, that's what we do every Sunday. But through that process, it really helped me to develop a faith that was my own, and getting to see people in close proximity who lived that out in the context of their families and the way they serve their community, really that was perhaps the most impactful part of that.
So when we think of religion, virtually any religion, there's both there's a faith in something, and there's some core principles, basic first principles, and then there's the, as you say, living it out. So what was it that you were trying to live out? What were the core principles?
Yeah, I think the way that I would say probably what spoke to me most in those years was simply, loving your neighbor as you love yourself, right? The ability to really kind of get outside of yourself, which I think is hard to do. And those, your brain's still developing, the idea of being compassionate and empathetic is perhaps a hard stretch at times. And so, to me, I think through really exploring that, and then I think the opportunities we had to, whether it was a missions experience or finding ways to serve in our community, there was something about that felt more meaningful than, some of the other things I was using my time for as a high schooler, right? There seemed to be something at work at a deeper level at that point, and I probably couldn't have articulated that, but I wanted more of it, right? And I think, the teachings that we received were really rooted in that, right? Which I think is not unique to Christianity, kind of as you've kind of mentioned too, but certainly was something that helped to root my life.
So with that in mind, with you as the person being guided, you later became the guide. Did you feel guided as the guide?
Yeah.
Tell me about that spiritual side, because you became a pastor,
Right.
a minister.
Yeah.
This wasn't a social service organization.
Right.
You were hoping and striving to bring people to Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And to help them to develop a personal relationship with God. And that runs pretty deep.
Yeah.
And then trying to, am I right?
No, absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. First of all, with you personally, and then what you were, maybe some experiences with helping others to experience that as well.
Sure.
Let's talk about that experience.
Yeah. I think in terms of, my own faith and the development of that, again, I think growing up in the context of a faith community, you sometimes you can adopt that through osmosis before it becomes like your own belief. But, I do know for me, there were, and I remember having classmates in high school in particular, and I would see the way that they just would treat people and the things that they, just seeing the way that they operated in high school. And I remember moments where I kind of looked around and I thought, it's just different what they're doing and what's leading them to do that. And it really was this faith that was operating at a deeper level than mine. And in high school, my senior year, my classmates elected me to be like the president of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, that club in our school. And it was sort of people know I'm a Christian, like that's, and so it was sort of like a wake up call to be like, oh, people are recognizing me as this, but, do I really believe, it was sort of this crisis moment in my life where, it really led me to question, like, is this authentic? Right. Do I really, do people think this because I go to church, or do they think this because I really have placed my faith in God and I'm living that out in a particular way? And so, and those were things that I would work out with my youth pastor and even, my brothers and others would sort of help be a sounding board for that. But I think that was a moment that really sort of led me to a deeper faith, really, and probably more questioning than I had previously done. And, adopting, this is not just something that I casually do on Sunday, but really developing a relationship with God, at that point in my life, that became real. And so I think having had that experience in my life, so as I'm working in youth ministry, having that experience in my life, sort of, I think it guided the way that I did youth ministry too. I really, to me, it never was about, coercing kids or, I remember, going to events, with other youth groups where it seemed like the goal was like to scare you into some kind of faith, right? Like, and it never seemed to resonate really well with me. And so for me in youth ministry, I really, that relational sort of approach is really what I sought to do. I hope to get to know kids and develop their trust, but also to help them ask questions on their own and to be a resource to them, but not someone who was just going to say, well, here's the answer. You believe what I believe, or else it's you're wrong, but and that was the way that I was guided, right? It's like, oh, ask those questions, think through that, read this, see what you think. And so, that's very much the same, that's very much the same way that I tried to approach ministry as a youth pastor too.
And you're talking about this in terms of relationships, two dimensions, almost like flip sides of the same coin. One, love of God and from God, and second, loving neighbor as oneself. And so as you talk, I can see how these two levels or dimensions of relationship blended.
Sure.
And reinforced one another.
Yeah.
And how you, once you started taking a leadership role, felt an obligation apparently to explore, as you say, is this authentic? Is this real, one might say?
Yeah.
And apparently you found out that it is.
It felt true and real to me. It really, and I think for me, I've certainly have always been aware, and I grew up in the South in the Bible Belt, I mean, you were, I feel like it's changed a lot, even in the 20 or so years since I left, but, it was, the base level assumption for folks was like, oh yeah, they believe in God, they're a Christian, right? So it just was culturally, that's kind of the expectation almost. I'm not sure where I'm going with that. What was your question again?
Well, at some point you discovered it is real.
Right.
This is reality. And it's something more than just what you see, what you can sense with your five senses. There's something more to reality, to even eternity, than just what we see, touch, feel, taste, hear. Right. And that led to you live out that faith, those principles, that way of life. It took you in a different direction than business and
Sure.
all of that, although that's probably helpful background for you in your current position.
Yeah.
Well, how long were you pastoring?
So I became the youth pastor in 2009, and then in 2013, there's more transition at the church. I was the interim co-pastor for a year, and then I became the lead pastor in 2014. So I did that until, a week before the pandemic shutdown in 2020 is when I accepted the continuum of care coordinator position, is what it was called at that time. So really was my internship started in late 2004. So by the time you did the internships to becoming the youth pastor to becoming the lead pastor, that lasted all the way until 2020.
Well, let's talk about that transition then from being the lead pastor of a congregation with all the responsibilities and opportunities to make a difference in people's lives and enrichment in your own life that would afford. And then you made this transition. You say you accepted the offer. Okay. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that, to move from that to becoming the executive director of then Heartland Continuum of Care and now Heartland Housed. Tell us the story.
Yeah, I think a lot of that was that transition almost was born out of the ministry that we were doing as a church. I think one of the benefits that I received personally from being a part of the church I worked at was that it was a community that really sought to not just show up on Sundays, but really thought, okay, if we believe this is good news, then it ought to show up in our neighborhood and in the city that we live in. And so in a lot of different ways, the church was active in ministry, had developed a real strong partnership with a local elementary school and was figuring out ways to just serve and enrich the lives of students and families. And so somewhere along that journey, we had gotten to a point where we began to sort of question, we're doing a lot of things in the community, and whether it's a big Thanksgiving Day meal or passing out Christmas presents, like we're doing nice things, but should we be thinking about these things that we're doing at a deeper level? And so there was a book that was popular around that time by Robert Lupton called Toxic Charity. And so that book became I think an opportunity for our faith community to sort of dig in a little bit deeper and just say, well, what are we hoping to create in our community, and how are we investing both our time and what resources we have as a church to really make change that is transformative and that could be long lasting. And so one of the things that we did as a church is we were passing out just small bags of groceries. So if a person came and didn't have food, we would pass that out. But we were often getting questions about, this is a situation I'm in and I need some help. And I remember as we would sit with people, a lot of times I would at the end of those conversations be like, I have no idea. I have no idea where to, I know that I think this group serves men. I think this group serves, I'm not entirely sure, and so, and a lot of us felt that way, right? That there's all of these things and we're trying to point people to, but are we even pointing people to the right resource? And so I just got interested in that, got more interested in that. Like as a church, we're doing these things, but are we doing them in a meaningful way that actually helps people?
And part of that help sometimes is connecting people to the right resources or the right help, because you can't do everything. No organization, no person certainly, but no organization, including a church, can do everything.
Right.
And there are other resources in a community. But I can tell you, that is what you're describing, I think, is more the norm than anything.
Sure.
Where people have a desire to be helpful, and yet, how can I be helpful? I don't even know what resources to connect people to. Yeah. That's a need in itself, and hopefully this conversation will help a bit with that. Yeah. But tell us where that led.
Yeah, so somewhere along, and there were a lot of dynamics there, right? So I had been at the church for a long time, and even, taking, as we talked about, I never saw myself being the lead pastor at a church and preaching most weeks. I think I've always been more happy to be a behind the scenes type of person. And, but again, at that moment, it felt like there was a leading there, or it was the next best way for me to try to serve that community that I love deeply. And, so somewhere along the way, I just got really tired. I don't know that I would use the phrase burned out, but, my family was growing, and I was involved in meetings, and while I started out doing youth ministry and felt really passionate about that, it felt like my time and energy was being, spread out in directions that maybe were not quite as fulfilling to me too. And so, and then there's just the transitions that most faith communities are going through in these days, as you kind of, that church in particular was, almost 200 years old. So it's got this rich, long history, connected to ways of doing things. And, the world around us is very much different than it was, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so, those questions of how do we do ministry now in this time, in this place, in this neighborhood, those are tough questions for churches to ask. And so we're working through those things, and there's always conflict that emerges in that too. And so we were navigating that, and, and I think I just got to a point where I felt like, I've been here a long time, I've done the best that I could do, but I started to get this sense that, I feel like it might be a good time for somebody else and their energy and passions to come alongside this faith community and see where they can lead them. And then that sort of corresponded.
Let me interject here.
Go ahead.
Do you see the hand of God in that?
Absolutely.
In a sense, you are describing a decrescendo of enthusiasm for what you were doing at one point, and a growing crescendo of being drawn in another direction.
Yeah.
And that's completely consistent with God calling you to move on from one thing to another. If you continued to be as filled with the Spirit of God to do what you were doing, you'd never do anything different.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
I think it's important for people to know that sometimes when God is moving them from one thing to another thing, that's not that you've failed or somehow you're just restless, right, but that sometimes there's more.
Yeah. And that I think that's very well put, David. And that's a painful, I think it's hard in the middle of it sometimes to see that, right? Because, I felt that, but you do feel a sense of failure, and you do feel a sense of, but if I leave, won't I be abandoning these folks that I love? And, so you've got that part of it, but you also have the part where, maybe you're tired and your passion is kind of elsewhere. And so, it is, I think it's a difficult thing to navigate, but I think when you get to the other side of it, hopefully, I hope that everybody, my experience has been, there were things that in ministry I would do, and I would say, I'm not very good at this, but this is the role, so I'm doing it. And it was a broad role, right? So you had to do a lot of different things. And so some of it got me excited, and some of it didn't. And that's probably the nature of any job. But when you have a job that's not just a job, right? This is not just connected to my own spirituality, but I feel a deep sense that I need to care well for the folks that I'm serving, and I want, to the degree that I can imperfectly do that, I want to point them to the God that we've gathered to worship. It's a really complicated space to navigate, but You
really do need to feel your way along, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's of course there's an intellectual, mental, and emotional dimension to it, but there's also kind of feeling spiritually. Where is it that I'm being drawn?
Right.
Where do I get this resonance?
Absolutely. Yeah. So along the way too, I think there's part of it too, right? I got my master's degree in 2009. In 2000, I can't remember what year, I think 2012, 2013, I started a Doctor of Ministry program back at Northern. So I graduated that in 2015. And so the other part of it too is like, I've invested all of this, like in this education, and the whole reason of doing that was so I could serve this faith community well. But as that journey went on too, and, navigating this with my wife, there was a sense where, I would pray, there probably was a year-long period where I really felt this sense that it was time for me to move on and time for me to do something different. But I also felt very conflicted about it, and so I would, my wife and I would talk about it, and I would pray, God, if it's okay for me to move on, I want to feel some sense of release, right? I was in that space for quite a while. And that would have been like 2019, 2020. The summer of 2019 here in Springfield, there were conversations around the Center for Health and Housing was a project that was emerging in our community. Helping Hands was working to create this shelter that would be more of a one-stop shop and a place that might be able to pull together more services for people with complex needs. And I think most of our community got really excited about it, but the location was problematic, and that's probably going too deep into it. But over the course of that conversation for the Center for Health and Housing, I remember going to an event and hearing Erica Smith talk about how we as a community could address homelessness. And there was something with that resonated with me really deeply, because for the first time, I felt like I was hearing somebody say, there are pathways to actually help people in their homelessness, as opposed to, I'm thinking about, again, the conversations and the work that we had done as a church. It was always like, well, let me just kind of help keep you going, right? Or let me help point you to a shelter bed or give you, a little bit of food. And so it felt like approaching that conversation in a more holistic and ultimately effective way. And I thought it was exciting, and really fascinating. But, and then by the time we got to November of that year, I really had got to a point where it's like, okay, I guess probably two parts of that, right? One for me was that, I knew that I did not want to go into another, lead pastor ministry type of setting. And then the other part of that was, really felt a sense that, we've invested a lot of time, not just in this faith community, but in Springfield. And, this is our home, and we love the city. And so we want to stay here and invest in the city too. And so, trying to navigate, those two parts of it, and just kind of, I think the other thing for me is like, okay, I pursued a degree in middle grades education. I've been a pastor now for, all these years. Am I employable? And like, what other kind of job could I get? And so,
Reverend Dr. Sabo.
Right. Yeah, sure. They're like, what are you doing here? That was a really, I had no idea how to, I started to have a few, meetings with people that I trusted in town to just say like, hey, here's where I'm at. What do you think? And, people in different sectors. And so, that led me to kind of putting in my application in a few different places. And I talked to a couple people who kind of pointed me to this position with the Heartland Continuum of Care that was being created. And so I did some more research on that. What is a continuum of care? And kind of looking at that, and decided, around the end of 2019 to submit my resume for that position. And so that led to the interviews, and then to being offered the position right before the pandemic started.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, obviously your application was well received. You were offered the position. You made the transition. What is it that Heartland Continuum of Care, and now the name changed to Heartland Housed. Tell us about that. What is the mission? What was it that you moved from one mission to another mission?
Sure.
What was this new mission?
I think, for me, one of the things that, I guess in my time of ministry, I think one of the things that's resonated with me a great deal. I'm a big fan of Dallas Willard as a theologian and a philosopher, but in particular, I love the way that he talked about the kingdom of God as being, not something. I kind of grew up with a sense of like, oh, one day we'll be in heaven and that'll be great, and so it was
the kingdom of God as being in heaven someday.
Very escapist, very like one day we'll get out of this place and then that'll be wonderful. And, as my faith evolved, I really began to this idea that the kingdom of God as a kind of now and not yet type of reality became, really captivating to me, but also really meaningful in the sense of, we can, I believe it's true for us to live our lives now in such a way that heaven is experienced amongst us, and I think that's what happens when we love our neighbor as ourselves and we're willing to live sacrificially and, give of ourselves for the good of others. It leads to people experiencing something that is more like heaven than hell.
And that's, in my mind, that's New Testament Christianity.
Right. Yeah. It shouldn't be that. I don't know that it should be that foreign, but there's probably a whole podcast and conversation there about the development of American Christianity, but absolutely, but I really love the way that Dallas Willard sort of explored that, and it was really meaningful to me. And so, for me, I didn't really view this position as like leaving ministry. Like for me, the work is to invest my energy and whatever I can do in a way that ultimately makes our community better and in the process more like heaven. And so around the issue, I think there's a lot of ways. I think we could do that throughout our lives and in all kinds of different vocational spheres. But for me, this was an opportunity to focus on the issue of homelessness with the mindset of, when we can provide opportunities for people to end the support for people in their homelessness, it has an opportunity to really bring healing and wholeness and all those types of things, but also to improve our community and make our community a better and better place to live.
So let's talk about the problem that you have devoted yourself to seeking to solve, namely homelessness. Now, this homelessness may mean a lot of things to a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah. I think you alluded to it well, that when we talk about homelessness, we're talking about a complex issue. And you have issues of people's perception, you have issues around, well, who really is homeless and what is that experience like? And, even if you think about our own federal government, right, the Department of Education has a different definition for homeless than housing and urban development does. So and that impacts grant funding and all that, and who you can serve. But, at the end of the day, homelessness is being unhoused, right? It's not having a place to call your own, a stable place to call your own. And so in our community, at the time of the 2022 point in time count, we had about 264 people who were homeless at that time. So that means they were either living on the streets somewhere, they were unsheltered, or they were living in an emergency shelter or a transitional housing program. And when I say homeless at that time, that means that they were literally homeless per housing and urban development's definition of that. At the same time, that doesn't count the families that our school system counts, people who are doubled up, families living in situations like that, or living in hotels and paying for their own hotel. In that scenario, they wouldn't count under HUD's definition. So, even how you count it and what it means and what is the real impact in our community is a really hard thing to wrap your mind around. I think as a community, our perception of whether homelessness is getting worse or not is, whether we see panhandlers or, when we come downtown, if we see people around the bread line or around particular locations. And I would say if you look at our local data in our community, the issue has steadily grown, but we're not dealing with something on the scale of what other cities are dealing with. If you think about places where there's a particularly high cost of living, that almost always corresponds with higher rates of homelessness, because I think there's a direct link between the cost of housing and the ability of people in our society to remain housed. And then when you factor in things like adverse childhood experiences or substance use challenges or mental health challenges, all of these are barriers that ultimately can lead to a person not having the resources or the wherewithal to remain stably housed. So here in Springfield, we've gone through this long process over the last couple of years of developing a strategic plan. And, corresponding with that, we did a lot of data analysis too, to just sort of say, who is homeless in our city, and almost 90% of the people that are homeless are single men, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Historically, as a community, we have more programs for families, whether they're transitional housing programs or permanent housing programs, and I think that's probably not uncommon. I think most communities would say, we really don't want children to be without a home. Also, the dynamics with families are often different too, because families are more likely to double up than for a family to be out on the streets. And so there's some dynamics around that kind of impact that data as well. But then I think we talked about this a bit earlier, when you think about what resources are available in our community, a lot of the resources are very specific in terms of, this organization serves women only, or women with children, or this organization serves men. And, so to navigate all of that is a really interesting thing in our community. And, prior to my position in 2020, all of these organizations are doing great work, but our community as a whole had never really staffed the collaboration of all that work. And so my position was, in a sense, people in our community saying, I think it would be beneficial for us to have someone or a team of people who are actually helping to try to pull all this together and support these organizations as they work together. And oftentimes, even if they're across different populations, serve the same person in different programs. And so that's a lot of the work that we've been doing the last couple of years, is really to not begin to convene people, because, the agencies were meeting, as the continuum of care, but to begin, providing some support for them to not just meet, but to say, okay, how can this all work together? What are we trying to accomplish together? And how could we actually do it? And so there's interesting and tough conversations around that for communities to have. I think if you look historically at how communities have addressed homelessness, the historic model is a model that's called housing readiness. So it means basically a lot of programs are created so that an individual or a family can engage in a program, and hopefully at the end of it, you're deemed ready for housing. And so hopefully they'll help you take that next step. I mean, that's typically how you solve this problem. And it's not a bad solution, right? It works for a lot of people. The challenge with, housing readiness programs is that sometimes the barriers to get in are kind of high. If you want to be a part of this transitional housing program, I need you to follow all my rules. I need you to come to this class 4 times a week. And if you don't do that, then you're going to get kicked out. And there's some people that are going to be in that program and probably excel. And then there's some who are never going to be able to probably get in the front door.
Readiness is not easily achieved for some people, or even achievable, because of various things. I mean, for example, if a person was dealing with the dopamine craving because of dependence on alcohol or other drugs, well, you have to deal with that, because it's not just a behavioral, teaching people how to manage money and helping them get a job and providing food and all that. Okay, you're ready for housing. Well, no, they're not yet.
Right.
Or people with mental illness.
Yeah.
Okay, you're not going to solve that mental illness problem by coming to classes and whatever it may be. Hence the continuum of care concept that you're talking about, where Heartland HOUSED, or formerly Heartland Continuum of Care, acts like an umbrella organization to deal with the whole, to coordinate, to identify and coordinate resources in our community to deal with this continuum of problems. So housing readiness is one approach.
Yeah. And over the last couple decades, Housing First has been, the emerging model, the emerging practice. It was adopted by the federal government around 2012. And the idea is a bit different in the sense that the goal is to help a person get into housing as quickly as possible. So kind of with the understanding that, it's really hard to address mental health or substance use or any other challenges that you're facing, even in the most well-run shelter, right? The experience of homelessness is inherently traumatic. And so when we can connect a person to a housing unit as quickly as possible, but then wrap all the support around them, case management and connection to whatever services that person needs to address whatever else they're experiencing in life, it's proven to be more successful. The research has bared out over the last couple decades and more cost effective for communities. And so a lot of the strategic plan that we've developed over the last couple of years is really built on this Housing First model. And, when you talk about all of the organizations and the continuum of care, the goal is to really get to a point where we as a community are working with people on a by name basis, right? So we're not just saying, okay, well, there's 264 people who are homeless right now, but to get to a point and level of resources where each one of those 264 people at this given point in time has a case manager, has somebody who's really working with them to identify what's the next step. And then one of the things that we're trying to do is to scale housing opportunities to a degree that we can actually have options available for people. And so that's one of the challenges for our community is, in part, we really have been slow to adopt a Housing First model. And I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that, but it's also had consequences because as the federal government made that their primary focus and our community didn't really build out Housing First programs, grant funding coming into our community has dropped by $250,000 since 2010. And so those resources are less plentiful. And then what happens when you're not connecting people with housing opportunities, you have more people who are needing emergency shelter services. And so you have to do things like create an overflow shelter and as a community spend money on that. And so the more money you're spending on these temporary solutions, the less money is available to actually help create those housing opportunities that ultimately can help a person become stable. And so it really kind of creates this really damaging cycle for our community where you have to triage the need, right? We don't want people living in tents or living outside. We want them to have a warm place to go. But at the same time, sometimes, as we do that, if we don't build out these other opportunities, we almost just perpetuate the problem. And so a lot of the emphasis that we're putting together through the strategic plan is on these housing opportunities. How can we create, in particular, I don't know how far you want me to go into jargon, but rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing are the two key programs that we're trying to scale to such a degree that, ultimately the end goal is to, if a person experiences homelessness in our community, to connect them with a supportive housing opportunity in 30 days. And we're a long ways away from that. There's a tremendous amount of work to do, but that's where we're trying to get. And with the belief that if we do that, not only is it healthier for the individuals and families who experience homelessness, but it's healthier for our community as a whole. It impacts, you really, if you just think about it, not from a moral perspective, but from a fiscal perspective, a lot of the research studies show that communities spend about $40,000 a year to provide emergency shelter services and ambulance services and emergency room services and all these types of, services that are available in our community. But to support a person in supportive housing takes about $13,000 a year in Springfield. Well, it's not true in Chicago or San Francisco or some of these other communities, but with cost of living being what it is here, it is doable for especially a single individual, about $13,000 a year. So it makes fiscal sense for our community alongside, in my opinion, the moral imperative to actually ensure that our neighbors have a safe and stable place to call home.
Well, when that happens, someone is more tethered. I mean, being tethered to a place helps a person have stability, be more tethered
Sure.
just mentally, emotionally in life. It frees up a person's, all of us have only a certain amount of bandwidth for thinking about each day about what we're going to do. Well, okay, if you're thinking about where you're going to sleep tonight or where you're cold now and where are you going to go, you're not thinking about long-term planning. Yeah. It's all short-term.
When you think about a place to call home and you think about mental health needs and substance use needs or challenges, I think when people think about homelessness, their perception is mental health, substance use. Think about what it's like to be on medication, but to not have a home, to not have a shelf that your medication sits on that you take at a certain time each day, right? Or one of the things that we've really made a point of emphasis is to work towards including people with lived experience. And the goal is in every task group and every board to ensure that there's people who have had lived experience of homelessness in the last 7 years and all of these things. And what happens and we've got a long ways to go, but as we do that, you get the perspective of people who say, I wasn't an alcoholic before I was homeless, but when I would wake up each day and I would leave the shelter at 7 a.m. and it's cold outside and I had nowhere to go, my thought was, I'm going to get drunk as quick as I can because I hate this experience. I'm miserable. And so a lot of times, some of the things that we look at and we might automatically assume, well, that person's homeless because of that, particularly around mental health or substance use, those can flow from homelessness, not necessarily be the cause of it.
Be the other way around, the effect rather than the cause.
Exactly.
Which gets to the complexity issue you're talking about.
Right.
Now, as you talk about having a strategy, the end goal, as I understand it, of the strategy that you and others have been involved with here in Springfield is to achieve functional zero homelessness in Springfield by what sort of time frame have you set out?
Our goal is by 2028. So it's ambitious, right? Because in particular, when you think about permanent housing opportunities, for the average person, meaning there are some pockets of the community, like veterans, for example, where there's more resources available. But we have fewer than 100 permanent housing opportunities for people who are non-veterans. And our goal is to build, or I say build, but I should clarify that. Our goal is to create 765 housing opportunities in 5 years in order to reach that goal. Now, those housing, that doesn't mean we're trying to create 765 units of housing, right? We want to work with landlords and use mostly existing units in our community, though we do need to develop, more affordable housing. But so those housing opportunities are those permanent supportive housing opportunities and rapid rehousing that I talked about. So it's really about a lot of times pairing a rental subsidy with case management support. So we need to hire and fund more case managers working in our community, more energy going into that, but we also need to give them tools to be able to support people in housing. And so there needs to be funding available for rental subsidies as well. And then beyond that too, those case managers are going to be working with people and saying, well, what services do you need? And so there's other services that need to grow and scale in our community too, in order to reach that goal. And so our strategic plan, it's almost like these concentric circles, right? You've got these housing opportunities. We know we need to create those. We also know that the system needs to work better. When we talk about community members having no idea where to refer somebody to or what to do, right? That's a sign of an ineffective system. And so being able to not just communicate where to go, but to really kind of create easy access, remove as many barriers to service as possible. Our system's got a long ways to go in order to get to that point. I know you've experienced that as you've walked with people, towards like, okay, how do we get you help, and how many hurdles do we have to go through in order to get there? We've got to make that a better process. And then we also know that there are a lot of individuals, there are people in our community who, maybe it's an employment situation and they have an episode of homelessness. And with the right resources, they could get back into housing and employment and thrive in 3 weeks' time. And then we have people who are dealing with more complex challenges and need more complex care. And that's going to sometimes require, better interaction and better collaboration from many systems. Like in some cases, the justice system, our hospitals, or, and healthcare system. We've got to be working collaboratively across all of these different systems and then working to provide that complex care. So that's a part of the strategic plan as well. And then I know we've talked about the continuum of care in Heartland HOUSED. As I've kind of mentioned, so my position was created in 2020. And so really, what we aim to do is use a collective impact model. Like there's no one organization that's going to solve homelessness. There's no one person that's going to do it. It really requires all of these organizations that we have in our town. So many great organizations doing great things. When we all collectively work together in the same direction, that impact is ultimately what's going to help us reach functional zero. But you also need kind of like a foundation or a backbone to that in order to help us get there. And so Heartland HOUSED is this, new nonprofit that really it's doing the same work, supporting the continuum of care, but the goal is to expand it in order to be able to provide more training and more services and more support to our organizations as they work together to reach that collaborative goal.
Let's talk about what I sometimes call the resource riddle, because it's obvious, as you've alluded to my own experience trying to assist in finding stable long-term housing for someone with some substantial mental health issues that aren't just going to go away. And in fact, they're getting worse. Okay, well, just getting an appointment is sometimes really a challenge. Why? Because, staffing is a big problem for people in the behavioral health field, as well as other areas of health. But mental health, behavioral health, which would a little broader concept than just mental health, as a field, as a profession, is suffering because of diminishing resources, housing for people, residential shelter for people with significant mental health problems, let alone severe mental health problems, has really diminished in Springfield and a lot of other places because of diminished funding for those sorts of things. And of course, this is all a matter of priorities in budgeting.
Right.
Now, it's very easy for people to turn a blind eye toward the homeless, to just, and I'm not saying that I'm invulnerable to this, just kind of look the other way. This makes me feel uncomfortable to face these sorts of things. And, go on with life. That's not living the religion, looping back to what we started this conversation, to look the other way. But at the same time, there are competing priorities. When you have to choose between competing goods, those are the really difficult decisions.
Yeah.
So these sorts of resource issues have to be part of the strategy as well, and you can't just come up with a plan to actualize it. You've got to somehow be able to find the funding, and the funding depends upon setting priorities. Now, there's altruistic reasons for wanting to deal with the homeless problems, package of problems, because it's the right thing to do. But there's also very selfish reasons for wanting to deal with it. And you've alluded to this, which is it's more cost-effective to solve the problem than to just try to live with the problem or something like that. And particularly with people who can become tax-paying, job-holding members of the community with a little support and a little help. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
But even with people with bigger problems, those problems don't go away. And I can tell you, just as an anecdotal illustration, in my prior life as a federal prosecutor, there were cases that would come up where, as the weather would get cold, colder it got, there at some point somebody would make a threat against the president. Okay, the Secret Service swoops in, investigates it. They're arrested. They go and they sit in jail. Warm, fed.
Sure.
And remarkably, as the weather gets warmer, they're no longer deemed a threat and all of that. Well, this was a manipulative way of getting housing. And I am sure if we had a sheriff sitting there, our sheriff, any sheriff, they would tell you, oh, yeah, the jails become the sheltering solution of last resort.
Yeah.
And for some, it's the default sort of thing. It's the same sort of problem as the emergency departments. People go to them because they don't have primary care physicians, so they go to the emergency department. Well, these are very expensive solutions to a problem that could and should be solved more effectively and more cost-effectively through other means.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same principle applies likely to so many different issues that we face as a society. So I think and I think that's one of the challenge too, because everything you said in terms of turning a blind very much I wrestle with those same things, and then we all hit the issue of just capacity too, right? Like how much can we do, and I also think that's why it's important for us to really think about this issue, not just as a moral imperative or an issue of our faith, whatever our faith is, but to think about it from the standpoint of an educated citizenship. That what does it look like for us as taxpayers to say, why do we always react to everything, and why does our community have to structure itself that way? Why can't we go upstream? The thing that I talk about as we and again, I think we're uniquely positioned as a community to address this issue, in part because of our cost of living. And then I think just in part because of our community structure. We have some really great partners that are here in town. Not every community in Central Illinois has all the resources and opportunities that we do.
There are a lot of caring people.
Willing
absolutely. To put that care into action here in Springfield.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, for us, one of the things that I like to talk about is like chronic homelessness can be eliminated. Chronic homelessness is when a person is been homeless for longer than a year, right? Part of getting to functional zero is ending chronic homelessness, meaning that people aren't homeless in our community for longer than a year. But as you deal with, as you deal with solutions, create solutions that people can engage with to end their homelessness, you get to a point where, as a community, if we reach functional zero, there's still going to be needs. There's still going to be some resources that have to be invested in addressing homelessness because poverty still exists. All these struggles still exist, but we can begin to reposition those resources a bit, right? The best dollars we could spend as a community would be to prevent somebody from becoming homeless in the first place, right? If you think about what that experience is like for a family or a child, it's traumatic. And the research shows that children who experience homelessness are more likely to experience homelessness later in life too. So as you look at where the issue is now, and you think about the fact that we can scale a better solution in our community, I think it's also important to think about, well, it doesn't just end there, right? But the system changes to be more proactive instead of reactive. And those solutions need to be built now, even while we're trying to address the backlog and the lack of housing opportunities. But you do get to a point where you spend less money to prevent homelessness. And, to me, that's an exciting place to be as a community. I think you could come back to the conversation we had about the kingdom of God and what that looks like, to be a compassionate community that values and loves our neighbors and wants them to be safe and stable in their housing. And housing, I think probably sometimes as I talk about this, sometimes I kind of take a step back and I feel like I know I probably sound naive or, overly optimistic about all of this. But, I recognize that housing is only one part of the challenge that a lot of our neighbors are facing too. I think it's a key challenge that has the opportunity to impact a lot of different parts of our health, but there's still a lot of needs that we need to take seriously addressing in our community. And, this is one of them. There are other key priorities too, but I think for us to, when it comes to turning a blind eye, I think that's the thing that I'm challenged by. And the more I learn and the more I get to know people who are kind of navigating these complex challenges, the more it sort of lights a fire in me to say, what are we doing? Why is the community, are we just constantly reacting? And, even when a solution is presented, why does it take us 5 years to adopt a solution? Why can't we as a community, with all the caring people and all the resources we have here, I think we're well positioned to move forward, but I would like us to take that same approach and apply it to different challenges our community faces as well.
Living our religion. I really don't know of anything that would be a more powerful motivator. Yes, self-interest, lowering taxes,
Sure.
But that's a little bit removed and a little bit maybe too theoretical for people. They say, well, okay, but you know what? It's easier just to ignore it and move on. If as a community we're going to deal with these sorts of issues, it seems to me it really that what is the driving, motivating power that will lead us to that, to actually face and deal effectively with these and related, similar, these concentric rings of issues. It's religion. Virtually any religion. This isn't unique to a branch of Christianity. It isn't unique to Christianity. It isn't unique to only religions even that are dominant in our community. It's interesting through my involvement with the Greater Springfield Interfaith Association to find out there are a lot more religions represented in our faith community here in Springfield than what I was aware of. And yet this is the sort of thing that as we live our religions, live our religion, whatever it may be, this is one of the ways that, I can tell you that I personally, and it's because of my personal involvement in a situation and prior conversations with you, because of dealing with, on my other podcast, the Justice Voices podcast, dealing with people as they get out of prison, coming back into the community. Housing is, of course, an immediate need from day one. Dealing with these issues, it's caused me to become more aware than I would be otherwise. Well, with that awareness comes a responsibility to anybody of any religion. And the only way you can escape it is to become numb to your own religion, it seems to me. And that's not a good thing.
Right.
So I really appreciate, and I'm sure that our listeners appreciate you sharing these things, the perspective. It's been thought-provoking. It's been feeling-provoking. And hopefully action-provoking.
I love it. Yeah, thanks, David.
This is God Unites, finding spiritual harmony as we explore common interests.